For some analysis, we're now joined by Professor Seyed Marandi, who's an Iranian academic and chair of the North American Studies. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you.
So the UN's nuclear watchdog chief says that he's looking for greater cooperation with Iran. Is this encouraging, or what's your take?
Well, it depends. The real issue is whether the United States and its allies will continue to have excess leverage over the International Atomic Energy Agency or not. This agency has had a history, a very bad history with Iran, leaking information from inside the country. The Iranians know that the intelligence used to murder some of its scientists came from the International Atomic Energy Agency monitors in Iran. And more recently, we've saw serious cases where they continue to try to acquire information that was not directly related to their responsibilities in Iran. So from the Iranian perspective, the agency is an international body. It should be able to help bring an end to the problems that exist between Iran and the United States. But the problem is that whenever Iran's problems with the United States and its allies intensify, that is when the agency tilts away or further away from Iran. When those tensions decrease, the agency then begins to behave in a more ordinary and normal manner.
So what do you think is likely to come out of Vienna? What's the best case scenario, but then what you think is most likely?
Well, the first thing that we always have to keep in mind is that it was the United States that left the nuclear deal, not Iran. It was the United States that violated the nuclear deal, not Iran. And it was the European allies of the United States that violated all of their obligations alongside the United States, whereas the Iranians continued to abide by their obligations and the agreement well after both Americans and the Europeans were in violation. So when we look at it historically, we see that the problem did not come from Iran. The problem came from Europe and the United States. And when you read the media, the Western media today, you get the impression that it's somehow Iran that is the problem. So if there's going to be a solution in Vienna, what needs to happen is that the United States and its European allies have to come and respect all of their duties and obligations in accordance with the nuclear deal before they can expect Iran to do the same thing. What we saw during the last round of negotiations a few months ago in Vienna between the previous Iranian administration and the P4+1 was that these countries under American duress, or at least Western countries under American duress, were trying to force Iran to accept many of the sanctions that were put on Iran after the United States left the nuclear deal, sanctions which violate the nuclear deal. They want Iran to accept those to remain in place, or many of them to remain in place, yet Iran go back and fulfill all of its obligations, plus something new. The Iranians are saying that's impossible. It's either the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that was signed in 2015, or nothing else. The Americans can't have extra. They cannot have more than what they got in 2015 on the one hand, and also expect Iran to give more than what it promised to give in 2015.
So is Iran quite happy, just to be clear, to re-sign, re-agree the exact terms of the 2015 deal, or has so much happened since then that perhaps some of those terms really do need to be relooked?
Iran is the only side, along with the Russians and the Chinese, that are willing to go back to the original deal. It's the Europeans and the Americans that don't want to go back to the original deal. And what is interesting is that the Europeans and the Americans are saying that, well, Iran has acquired new knowledge in the nuclear arena or the nuclear field of science since 2015, because when the Americans and the Europeans violated the deal, and after waiting a very long time, the Iranians restarted those parts of their nuclear program that they had stopped or slowed down in accordance with the deal. When that happened, it was the Iranians were doing it in accordance with the deal. The nuclear deal itself says that if Iran sees the other side in violation, the Iranians are allowed to restart their nuclear program. So even as we speak, when Iran is not abiding by its commitments, it's doing so in accordance with the deal. So the Iranians in the past and in the present have been working within the deal, within the framework of the deal. The other side, the Americans, the Europeans, the colonial powers, as it were, they were in violation then and they were in violation now. Yet if you read and watch the Western media, they will be talking about or discussing whether Iran will come back to the deal. It's as if it's Iran that is the problem. It is as if Iran has left the deal, whereas it's the other way around. So for Iran, the only thing that is important is for the Europeans and the Americans to implement the deal in full. They simply will, Iran will simply not accept the Europeans and the Americans saying, well, we'll go back to the deal, but we'll keep some of the sanctions, and then you Iranians have to do something more than what you did in the past. That's not going to work. And if they say that Iran has acquired new knowledge during this period, well, it's because Western countries violated the deal, hurt the Iranian economy, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars, definitely hundreds of billions of dollars, killing people in the process through the maximum pressure campaign, which was targeting women and children in Iran. So if Iran acquired knowledge that cannot be reversed, it was only because the other side violated the deal.
So how close is Iran to a full-on nuclear weapon?
Well, if Iran was actually trying to acquire a nuclear weapon, it would have done so many years ago. The Iranian leader said that on multiple occasions. The Iranians have no intention of having a nuclear weapon. If they did, Iran would have it as we speak. Iran's technological development in different fields, in artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, stem cell research, and other areas of science is well known. Iran is more developed than most other countries in the world. In nanotechnology, it's one of a handful of countries that is the most advanced on this planet, despite the sanctions. So Iran's technological capabilities, remember, Iran has sent satellites into orbit under sanctions. It has launched, and those satellites that they launch into orbit are Iranian satellites. We know of Iran's military defense capabilities. So Iran has the ability to make what it needs to make. And if it felt that it needed to make such a weapon, it would have by now. But Iran has not done so. The problem is not really Iran's nuclear program. The problem is that the United States and the Europeans want to undermine Iran. They want to weaken Iran. And the best thing that they can use as an excuse is Iran's nuclear program. Otherwise, the Israeli regime has nuclear weapons. Otherwise, the United States and the Europeans themselves gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, to use extensively against Iran during the 1980s. I survived those chemical weapons. The US government, the Europeans, gave those to Saddam Hussein. They gave him the weapons, the military intelligence to use them, and the political cover to get away with it. And the Western media was silent about it during the war, even when they gassed their own people. So it's not as if the Americans and the Europeans are concerned about illegal weapons. The fact is that Iran is by far the most powerful and independent country in West Asia and North Africa, this whole region. And the Americans want to weaken Iran. They even say it. They say that we want to have a deal where we can then put pressure on Iran by different means.
Is there a concern for Iran? Because there seems to be talk of a plan B, almost as if the Western nations are not expecting an agreement to come through, and their plan B might include things like ramping up sanctions. Israel is even talking about military action to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, maybe persuading China to shut off oil imports. Is this all a concern for Iran? Because this plan B is being talked about quite seriously, and it's almost as if they're going to press the button if Vienna fails.
Well, if they had all those buttons, they would have pressed them during the Trump regime. The maximum pressure sanctions are indeed maximum pressure. That means they did whatever they could. They're not in a position to do much more against Iran. And the whole plan B notion is a joke. Who is going to attack Iran? The Israeli regime, a small regime that if it launched a strike on Iran would be on the receiving end of thousands of Iranian missiles and drones. I mean, if anyone looks at the map, what could Israel possibly do to Iran, and what could Iran do to the Israeli regime? So the Israeli regime is not in a position to fight a war against Iran. Its existence is founded upon massive support from Europe and the United States. Their support for the apartheid regime is essential for it just to survive. So the Iranians don't take any threats from Israel seriously. That's for internal consumption in Tel Aviv and for their own politicking. But let's say the United States wants to strike Iran. The United States has just fled Afghanistan. They fled Afghanistan. And the United States, which fled Afghanistan, is going to launch a war against Iran. The Iranians would destroy all American bases in the region and those countries where those bases are held. The United Arab Emirates could never survive a counterstrike by Iran. The Americans know that. Bahrain could never survive a counterstrike by Iran. It would create a global economic crisis. It would bring about the downfall of these Arab dictatorships that are closely affiliated to the United States. And as I said, when we just saw the Americans flee Kabul, they're going to try to take on the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is by far the most powerful country in West Asia, and alongside its allies are a tremendous force.
If the talks in Vienna fail, is there a possibility that tensions between Iran and these Western powers could go back to pre-2015 levels? Or do you think it's just another failed talks and then you set up new talks?
Well, remember, what we see now is more the escalation is much greater than before 2015. Biden is implementing Trump's policies. Nothing has changed. The maximum pressure campaign by Trump was intended to crush Iranian civil society, to crush women and children, to crush people, to humiliate the nation, to destroy the lives of the people, to bring the nation to its knees so that the Americans could get what it wants. That was the objective. Of course, this was initiated by Obama, and Trump took it a step forward, a step further. Truly barbaric and truly inhumane. And these are crimes against humanity. Biden is following the same policy. He has changed absolutely nothing. Of course, they failed. and if you travel to Iran, you'll see that they failed. Despite the difficulties, Iran continues to be the most powerful country in this region. So their escalation, they've gone as far as they can. Anything further than this will create pushback from Iran that they cannot tolerate. Already Iran is pushing them back as we speak. Iran and its allies are pushing back the United States and its allies from across the board. And the result of which, one of the results was Afghanistan and the pressure that the Americans are facing elsewhere in the region. At a time when the United States is losing ground to China, at a time when China is moving past the Americans in the high-tech industries, their economy is doing much better than the United States, and the Americans are hemorrhaging because of their wars and occupation, the Americans are in no position to increase tensions with Iran. At a time when the United States is confronting the Russians in Ukraine and elsewhere, this is not a time for the United States to be able to throw its weight around against Iran. Iran knows that. Iran knows what's going on in the United States, the problems that we see between the different ruling factions in Washington, the tensions that exist between the United States and other rising powers, Russia, China, and Iran knows that the United States simply does not have the energy and the power to engage in some sort of military conflict with Iran, because it knows that under those circumstances, the big winner would be America's rivals. Just remember the scenes in Kabul and the American retreat. Is that an army that is going to defeat Iran?
Professor Seyed Marandi, always good talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
All right, that's Iranian academic Professor Seyed Marandi speaking to us ahead of the planned nuclear deal talks between Iran and a number of Western powers. And yeah, not a lot of optimism in the air about what might come out of those. Some countries talking about plan Bs in case those talks fail. And Iran talking a tough talk.